for this conference. First, I would like to ask how many of you heard about IPES? Okay, quite a lot of people, yeah. And how many of you heard about IPCC? Okay, so we have to change this, because IPES is much more relevant for our topics of forestry, water management, and including climate change. IPES is actually the brother of IPCC. It's an intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's really very horrible at the first reading, but this is actually an assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services regionally, globally, thematically, led by the United Nations umbrella and led by governments. And why governments are leading this program? Because the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, you probably heard about a lot, which was led by scientists, it was not heard by governments. So it was a very nice scientific compilation of the state of biodiversity, but nobody listened. That's why Mitterrand and some other politicians suggested to have an intergovernmental platform to be heard. And this is IPES. And our regional assessment on Europe and Central Asia was just published in the recent decades. So if you want to read what these 120 scientists put together about our nature, you can find it on the internet and you can download it easily. So what is novel? Why we are writing assessment after assessment? One reason is that since 2005, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, there are a lot of new research. What we heard in this conference is lots of new reviews, databases, big data databases. We also need more attention on institutions, because institutions drive change. People are driven by institutions. So if we don't focus, if we biologists don't focus on institutions, we will lose something and we will be less effective in protecting nature. That's why the inclusion of social scientists is prominent in IPES, not only in this conference but also in IPES. And we learn a lot from each other. So these biologists, social scientists exchanges are very active in the IPES. We are not in silos. We are writing the same chapters together. And another novelty of IPES, I will focus on this part, is the inclusion of indigenous and local or traditional knowledge, which is another knowledge system, and because we found out that science is simply not enough to answer the questions we have. There are lots of other knowledges out in the landscape, in the cities, in the forestry or water management engineering, which is not strictly science, but other more practical, more space-based knowledge systems, and we are very often forgetting this huge knowledge. And to really focus on this knowledge system exchanges and cooperation in knowledge system, IPES recognizes how important indigenous and local people and their knowledge and their practices are for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So what is indigenous and local knowledge? In our region we call it traditional ecological knowledge, because who is indigenous in Europe, it's not an easy question. Who is local, it's not an easy, but if we refer to traditional heritage, traditional knowledge, then we are more closer to what we are really focusing on. This is a cumulative body of knowledge, and what is interesting, it's within specific worldviews. So not the scientific worldview, but I would say that the same Judeo-Christian worldview is the basis of this traditional knowledge as science. So in this continent, traditional knowledge is more closer to science than, let's say, in Australia. This is the knowledge of people who are really connected to nature day by day. This is a knowledge that handed down culturally from generation to generation, very often with practices. And it's not static, it's not Skansen, it's not museum. It is still adapting. I will show you examples how traditional knowledge is adapting to modern times. And about what? Knowledge about nature and human-nature relations. What I would like to emphasize is that this knowledge is embedded in culture. It's not independent of culture. We have to be aware that also science is embedded in culture, in our culture. So our understanding of the world is culturally determined. And if you work together in IBDES with other people from other continents and other knowledge systems, then you surely realize how different people think about nature or forest or grasslands depending on the culture they are born in. This is an example that the hay was very wet. For 6 weeks there was a rain, and Marianne just stand at the door and said, "This blessed rain keeps raining," which means that the whole hay production for the winter is ruined. But they said the blessed rain, because in our continental climate, the rain is always blessed. We never say that stop, rain stop. We say that sun come up, but we never say that rural people in a traditional knowledge system, they never say that rain should stop. Why we are focusing on traditional knowledge in our area? Because we love those landscapes they developed. So that this knowledge developed certain type of landscapes, and we like these, and there are lots of natural values and conservation values in these landscapes. I don't want you to read this, but imagine that in the assessment there are lots of messages related to nature, biodiversity, ecosystem services and traditional knowledge. The key messages are only 5 pages, so you can read it in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And some of the key messages that one of the key ecosystem service which is declining the most in Europe is the learning from indigenous and traditional knowledge. So one service of nature that nature is teaching us, we are not using this service. That's one of the messages. And the other is that we still have traditional practices which can be subsidized by European funds. And what is really missing is the real participatory management of our protected areas. In Europe we have a typically top-down management. There are lots of grassroots innovation to turn it upside down, so to have bottom-up management of protected areas, but it's not really easy under the national and EU regulations we have. The Carpaticum Convention also focuses on traditional knowledge. We have a protocol under development called the Protocol on Cultural Heritage and Traditional Knowledge, which also acknowledges the contributions of local communities to nature, to knowledge and to management of areas and to the transmission of knowledge to future generations. And it emphasizes the need for international cooperation on this. So, traditional knowledge or research of traditional knowledge is a global trend. There are lots of key publications. One of them is this, just published this January. We were emphasizing in this paper that ecosystem services is a scientific concept, and many local worldviews don't fit into this categorization of ecosystem services. Most of the cultures don't regard these services as services. They regard it as gifts or contributions. And in this paper, which was published in a scientific journal, we argued that those classifications of contributions of nature to society, which are based on different worldviews, are also valid. So we should not exclude them when we are assessing nature and nature's contribution to people. There are other papers in other journals emphasizing the locus perspective. In the Arctic region, it's really very important because we lack long-term data sets on climate change and biodiversity change, but the locals do have these data sets. And this is my favorite book. Anybody who is working with grasslands and pastures, I would suggest to read this book. This was written by scientists, by practitioners and by herders in southern France. A fantastic book. And if you look at the title, The Art and Science of Shepherding, so it says that it's really a holistic approach. And there's a chapter on schools for herders, and there are some herders who study themselves, and so on and so on. The global trend is also visible in the Sustainable Development Goals. Traditional knowledge is mentioned there. And also, one of the Aichi targets of the Convention of Biological Diversity is explicitly focusing on traditional knowledge. So, target 18 says that we should respect, recognize, document and use traditional knowledge. I don't know how many of us biologists know that one of the Aichi targets is related to another knowledge system. And the next country reports, the CBD country reports, are due end of this year, and I wonder how many of the Carpathian countries will have a chapter or section on traditional knowledge in this country report. Who are these people who hold this traditional knowledge? They are very diverse people. One group is this old with a mustache, and they argue that I learned ecology not from books but from life. So if you visit these people, you really learn a lot. But there are other people who have traditional knowledge, like this guy, who is a semi-traditional herder, and he is reading something, you see? He is reading a paper which was written partly by him, so he is a co-author of the paper he is now reading. It was published in English, but that's the Hungarian translation, and it's the final proof of the text. And we also work together with other herders who are actually co-authoring the papers, because they provide so much knowledge to the understanding of the topic of the paper that they are co-authors, and that's a general trend globally. We have to respect those people we are learning from. And there are modern people like this guy who is monitoring the impact of beaver on his forest with a smartphone. And when we asked him what he knows about beaver, he just showed pictures from the last weeks as he monitors. So he's doing the same sort of things as his father and grandfather, but using modern technology. So this is also traditional ecological and traditional and open knowledge. With Daniela Babai, who will be the session leader in the afternoon, we work a lot in the Eastern Carpathians, and how we worked there, actually we lived there together with the locals for weeks. Or we went, joined them in their everyday life, and we were cutting protected species, thousands of individuals of orchids, you know, and we made bouquets to the women. But this is how you manage an area, and this is what we suggest. And also we are interviewing people in the field, in the room. There are other forms of working together with local people. This is when we had discussions in the field, and here you see, this is a Turkish guy working in Canada. He's the most cited traditional ecological knowledge expert. He has 71,000 citations, so you can imagine. And he was speaking with this guy for hours as equal, because both guys are very knowledgeable. And they had lots of questions to each other. So the herder was asking questions to the professor. And you could feel that they respect each other's knowledge, even if they don't agree in all aspects. There are other more formal ways of working together. This is in the UNESCO in Paris. It's one of the dialogue workshop of the European assessment, IPES assessment. And you see, this is a herder speaking in a film, and this is another herder participating personally in the meeting. And the authors of the assessment were asking these people. There was a guy from Siberia, and from France, from Sweden, and so on. And then we published the preceding volume, because scientists need citable documents. So based on these dialogue workshops, we put on paper some of the key messages what these local people had to IPES, to the IPES assessment, and they became citable. And if you check the report of the IPES, there are hundreds of citations referring to this preceding volume. Okay, so let's go for Carpathians, how traditional knowledge is functioning in our landscape. So this is the area we are working in, it's in Eastern Carpathian. We are currently at Csíkszereda region, Gimes, called Gimes. This is a cultural landscape, 250 years old, very species rich. So among the most species rich grasslands in Europe are some of these grasslands you see here. This was originally a forested landscape, and the people killed the trees one by ringing them or burning them. Actually, this is one of the most this is one of the most species-rich grasslands in Europe. And they settled in the valleys. In the mountains they have pastures. Actually, these pastures are much older. That's a diverse landscape with lots of flowers and grasses. And don't forget that these were forests originally, so these are secondary habitats, very species rich, full of protected endangered species, but these were created by people deliberately to increase the ecosystem service provision of the landscape. These were mainly done by hand, and they are still managing these areas. They are cleaning the bushes. They are weeding the grasslands from poisonous and other harmful plants. They are seeding some nutritious species. This is a non-native, in that landscape, non-native Onobrihi species. And this is one figure from the IPBES assessment, that you have two types of landscape. This is the order of the cultural landscape, and when you abandon this landscape, it becomes more diverse physiognomically. But what is interesting that both locals, and conservationists prefer this one, because this is very special at the European level. This is more species rich. This is dominated by pioneer species, and we have a lot of old growth forest and old forests in other parts of the Carpathians, so we don't need these secondary forests, but we do need these species-rich grasslands. About the knowledge of these people living in this valley, we studied only this single valley. It's a very small area. People know more than 200 species, which is about 85% of the biomass of the area, so they can name almost all plants that come up. And they distinguish a lot of habitats. So their knowledge on habitats is a world record. There's no other landscape on Earth where more folk habitat categories were documented than in this valley. More than 140. Imagine in a mountainous landscape, can you list? Yes, we can also list because we are scientists, but we have a totally different classification system. About some slides about the species knowledge, they distinguish many similar species like this Fragaria species, because the taste is different. So the enjoyment if you eat viridis is much bigger, so they have a deep knowledge what is the difference between the two species. Or the Primula species, which look really very similar. Some knowledgeable locals distinguish even these species. They have the same name for the two folk taxa, but they know what is the difference between the two. The Gentiana species, it's interesting that they don't think that they are related. All is an important folk taxon, separately classified and named and valued and collected, because they are important medicinal species because they eat a lot of meat. So they need this medicinal plant. And there are some traditions that survive from millennia-old human knowledge. You know why orchis are orchis, and people say that if you want to make your lover to be more loving you, then you have to provide these orchid tubers, but it does matter which one you use. Don't mistake the species. They are directing succession in their landscape, because succession is not always good for local livelihoods. So we asked them how they improve their pastures, and they said that they are clearing bushes and trees. And we asked how can a pasture degrade if you don't clear it. So it's a very simple management. They put the cattle there and cut the trees, and the cattle eats the grass. But if you ask about meadow management, hay meadow management, you got a much more complex answer. First, they remove every spring the ant hills, the mouse hills, the stone and twigs. They argue that if you want to maintain a hay meadow, you have to cut it every year. That's a very important practice. They also know about the regeneration of the species. There are two types of species. One is regenerating from the roots and the other from the seeds. So they also know that they have to let the species ripen, the seeds ripen. And that's why they have a rotation system. Still some farmers have this. And the problem is that the EU regulation, because it limits the hay mowing time, you lose this practice because you cannot leave or cut early your hay meadow. But this is a very deep understanding of ecology that they found it out, and we couldn't find any such suggestion in the ecological literature earlier. And the other is, I will speak about more details, the overseeding of these grasslands by local seed mixture, which they collect in the barn. So this is the process. You have the hay meadow, you cut the hay, you store the hay in the barn, and then what is falling out, it's a mixture of seeds, broken leaves and dust, and you put it into a barrel. They are showing that how many seeds you have in this, and then you bring this stuff onto your meadows and spread it. And in 1 liter of this hayseed, there are more than 60 species and more than 12,000 viable seeds. That's a greenhouse experiment done by Debrecen University. So you can imagine that how many billions of seeds are reseeded. And I don't know, if anybody knows such a practice in any of your regions, please come to us in the coffee break, because we are collecting data on this at the European level, and every country in Europe where we have detailed data had the same practice. So if you have a nice flower meadow in Europe, don't forget those people who actually scattered many seeds onto these meadows. This is also forbidden by the European Union. Who is threatening some of the species? So we went up with this guy to the mountain to collect medicinal herbs. And this one is Gentiana lutea, is a Natura 2000 red-listed, threatened, whatever species it is. This is the last population in the region, and we were digging out the roots, you know, because if you are doing participatory fieldwork, you have to join the locals. If they collect protected species, then you join them. And it was very, very useful, because at the beginning, as a biologist, I thought, oh, I will not destroy a population of a medicinal plant. But then, doing it for half an hour, I realized that we cannot remove the whole root system. And some individuals were visibly impacted by this root gathering, but they had the same amount of leaves and flowers. So, if you weed Silsium arbenzae in your garden, you know that by removing some of the roots, you don't kill the plant. So actually, these people are collected not to a high quantity, so they don't really threaten the population. What threatens the population? This guy here, Uniparus. That threatens because that overgrows the population and kills. And why this juniper can grow? It is because the nature conservationists, because they designated it as a national park, and they forbid this traditional practice of killing junipers in the pastures. People did it for centuries. Now there's no management, so the juniper will finally kill the Gentiana lutea, which is an important resource for the locals, and it's a rare species for us. So if you don't understand the traditional practices that impacted our habitats and species, we might end up in wrong decisions. Ecosystem services, this is very often argued that it's a new term, and I show you that this is not a new term. It is in 1786, so 100 years earlier than the first ever mention of ecosystem services globally. There was a review by Carpaticum, and it says that the benefits that are provided by nature for free, it is ecosystem services. It's explicitly saying that it is something that is provided by nature for us free. So these guys are really thinking long-term and protecting the natural resources. They are not conservationists, they are protecting the resources. And if the two are in parallel, then they are nature conservationists. If the two is not in parallel, then they are not. We published a book, a bilingual one, so it also has English on each page. I brought some copies of this book, so if you are interested in the knowledge of these guys, then you can read and see the pictures, many of the pictures I showed. But there's a problem. The problem is that this knowledge is eroding. We are losing this knowledge for many, many reasons. And this is a quantification of this loss. This is the Dimes region, 23 people, and we asked them 7 questions about the name, the use, the population dynamics of the species. And this is the proportion of the answers that had information. So locals could answer the question. So there were about 2,400 questions. And in the Dimes region, 34% of the questions were answered substantially by the locals. In Western Hungary, which is a more urbanized region, we had the same survey, and only 13% of the questions could be answered. So this is the loss of knowledge, which is clearly visible in our region. That's another study. We compared 2 types of knowledge. When you have knowledge, you have learned this knowledge from somewhere. And there are 2 main sources of learning. One is you are learning from the members of your society, of the village, teachers, father, mother, grandfather, or you can learn directly from nature. And so in this group, we have the names and the use in the folklore. You can only learn these from somebody. This is habitat, phenology, and population size of the species that we studied, 34 species. So you can only learn it actually by yourself, by looking at the species. You cannot learn it from the parents. And what is here, this is the age of the people. These are the young ones, these are the old ones. And you see that and this is a scoring of the knowledge. The knowledge that you can only get from somebody is decreasing more quickly than the knowledge you can get yourself. These are the children. Some of them will probably increase in their understanding. So this knowledge is decreasing much less than the knowledge what you have to inherit from somebody. About the policy, agricultural policy of the European Union, because the IPBES assessment also emphasized the need of more integration of traditional knowledge into national and EU level policies. These are the elements of hay meadow management. So what people do in the hay meadow, how they drive the species composition and species density or whatever features of the hay meadows. And let's see, this is the Dimes landscape. These are the elements of hay meadow management, and this is how often people did it in the 80s, based on interviews. And what happened in the last 30, 40 years, some of the practices decreased, some others increased, and the EU regulations, or the Romanian regulations, regulate these practices. The green ones are motivated and the red ones are forbidden. In another landscape, which is in Western Hungary, Őrség, 60s, 70s, these are the list of hay meadow management elements. This is how often they were done in the past. What happened? By the accession of the European Union, many of these practices decreased. And since the European Union, we have lots of subsidies going to these meadows. there's a further decrease. So there's a huge abandonment in this landscape. Again, we studied which elements are regulated, which ones are motivated, and which are banned. And our argument in this paper was that if you want to regulate management, you want to protect, you have to understand the management system first and then regulate, and not the opposite way, what happened when these Eastern countries joined the European Union, and many of these management practices were based on British, Dutch and German studies, which were culturally appropriate in those countries, but those which is working in the UK will probably not work in Hungary because we have totally different ecological and cultural environment. We can learn a lot from the West, but we have to do our own research in our own culture and landscapes. So some of the conclusions of this study was we have to focus on the markets and on the subsidies, because markets are needed for the people to provide food for the society, and there are lots of stupid regulations that prevent the selling of the milk from this landscape. The really stupid ones, I will not go into details. And subsidies can really help people because they need cash. So if you provide cash for these people, they can spend it on the schooling of their children, or on telephone, or electricity. And then they will continue many of the practices. They don't continue because it's uneconomical and because it's not respected. There's no price difference. Some of the adaptations of this area, that they replaced hand mowing with small machine mowing. We don't know exactly the ecological impact of this change. There are hypotheses that it is better for biodiversity, there are some others that is not as good, but more or less it's probably not harmful for biodiversity. What happens? They can mow the grassland 7 times faster, which saves time. They can have a second job, so people stay in the landscape, the grasslands are managed, and the biodiversity remains. What happened in the regulation? The regulation distinguished hand mowing from machine mowing. So if you cut it with a tractor, you would get less subsidies. But if you cut it with a handheld small machine, you also lose subsidies. So this is a stupid regulation. This is totally against our goals with these regulations. Okay, so who could help? Who could bridge the knowledge systems? So we have this traditional knowledge system and we have the scientific knowledge system. There are people who are in between. This is a study by Anna Varga. He interviewed conservation officers sitting in headquarters and ministries, herders, and also conservation rangers who spend most of their time in the field, or at least locally in the landscape. And as you see, that their knowledge, this is not general knowledge, it's traditional knowledge of these 3 groups. These rangers are in between the two. So they are knowledge brokers. And we know in Hungary, at least, many good examples how local understanding was transferred to a ministerial level and then back. So we have to believe that there is a chance of bridging this, and we can improve the situation. Environmental education, which is also discussed in the IBES assessment. Is it embedded in local culture? As we saw, traditional knowledge of nature is embedded in culture. I checked whether environmental education is embedded in culture, and I used a very simple method. First, I looked for motifs. I typed into Google Ukrainian motifs, Romanian motifs, and what you get a lot of folk motifs. Okay, so then I changed and I typed in környezeti nevelés, or also in Polish, and you get global symbols. Where are our Carpathian symbols? Where are our national symbols? So we are teaching our young generation in a culturally very simplistic, global manner. We don't connect our cultural understanding and environmental understanding. And I think that's a big mistake. And why environmental education is failing in many cases, I think because they are not embedded in the culture of deaf children, we want to work with. This is only one aspect. I know that it's much more complex, but this is I think this is a striking. And you can scroll down for long to find the first national or regional motif. This is all ruled by global symbols, global messages. So, the key messages. We still have traditional knowledge in our area, in the Carpatic scene is still rich, and if you compare it with the tropics or with the Inuits, our knowledge is still rich even in a global comparison. Unfortunately, it mostly survives in protected areas because economic development is less in protected areas and the subsidies help the maintenance, so we have to work to be better in this area. We need it for conservation, definitely we need it. In Western Europe, these areas are abundant, intensified, or the conservation management changed, let's say, from grazing to mulching, which is really not a sustainable management of these areas. We need integrated, participatory approach when we are managing protected areas. Probably we are less effective on the short term if we have discussions with the locals, but on the long term, the global experiences show that we are more efficient. In the impact assessment, we listed 8 key knowledge gaps, and from these 8, 2 were related to indigenous and local knowledge. One is that together with scientific knowledge, traditional knowledge can co-produce a more sustainable understanding of human-nature relations. And the other is that we need a stronger integration of this knowledge into national and international policies. And this is just an announcement that we are planning a forum, discussion forum, and a training course for post-Soviet EU countries, so from Estonia to Bulgaria, Croatia, Poland, Romania, organized jointly by the CBD and the IPES on traditional ecological knowledge, how this knowledge can be respected, used, documented in our regions. So if any of you are interested, please come to us and let's discuss this. So thank you very much for your attention. And
thank you, Zsolt, for very interesting presentation. We have time for a few questions.
Thank you very much for what was absolutely fascinating. I'm quite interested in how you arrive at the term ecological knowledge, because in many ways, if I were looking at the sustainability of households in this area, I'd be interested in knowing how they manage private water supplies, how they manage cheese production to ensure that you weren't getting microbial contamination and so on. And if you're looking at sustainability of these mountain households, actually it's a much more comprehensive indigenous knowledge system than one that relates to ecological knowledge, which is a social construct that you've applied on it, whereas their own construct might be different to the one that you're applying. And I just wonder if you could comment on the other bits of knowledge about sustainable living. My own observation to one or two other people was that the most sustainable living I think I've ever seen in Europe is in small peasant households in mountain communities of the Carpathians. But that embodies a whole other set of knowledges than those that you've described in the fields, important though they are for conservation, I accept.
Totally agree with you. Traditional ecological knowledge is a bad term because this is not traditional, not ecological, and not knowledge. Let's start from the end. This is not knowledge because knowledge is a scientific term, and this understanding is much wider. So it's knowledge, practice, and worldview. So that's the third word. The second word you referred, ecological. What is ecology? There are many understandings of ecology. There's also traditional environmental knowledge. And there are other synonyms. So I agree with you. I use the traditional ecological knowledge because I'm an ecologist. I'm focusing on that aspect of the whole holistic network of this knowledge. And I'm usually giving the examples from this ecological angle, but I totally agree. And this is not traditional because traditions are very often understood as something belonging to the past, and as you saw, this is belonging to the present, originating from the past, but developing. So this is my answer, that all these scientific terms are wrong when you want to describe a non-scientific, a phenomenon in a non-scientific knowledge system.
Any more questions? In that case, thank you very much, and we'll have a coffee break now. Please come to the closing ceremony also after the sessions.